Thank you.
Welcome to Carnegie.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm a professor at Cuyahoga Community College in the best campus of the four, which is Metropolitan Campus, the oldest campus. I'm not a native Clevelander. I'm sorry. I'm from Pennsylvania. I began teaching at Tri-C several decades ago as an adjunct instructor, and then I got a full-time job in 2003. And since I was working on my doctoral work at Case, which happened to be Cleveland history, they said, David, we have this course that's been laying dormant for over 5 years. You want to teach it? And I started teaching it, and I've been teaching it ever since. I am a historian of Cleveland. I've been working on that for several years. My major field is basically social history, which is the study of religion and labor in Cleveland is one of my topics of study. So I'm about to give you a grand tour. A grand tour of Cleveland from 1820 around maybe the present, if I can get there. Sometimes I get delayed. Basically, it's the story of the industrial sector of Cleveland, how it all got started, the various areas. Unlike other cities in the United States, particularly in the Midwest, Cleveland has several different industries that started, okay, all over the city, as opposed to some cities in the Midwest who have dominated by one or two industries. So in a sense, this is sort of like a virtual tour. I wish I had 3 or 4 days, then I could go into this in detail, but I know you don't have 3 or 4 days, even though I hope I get this attendance for my classes beginning next week. It would be nice. So I'd like to begin, the story of industrial Cleveland begins in 1820, okay? It begins with a guy by the name of Alfred Kelly. I'm on a movement, I'm on a one-man movement in Cleveland. There's a statue to about everybody in this town, everybody, but there's no statue to Alfred Kelly. And I'm trying to get a statue built somewhere. Alfred is the mayor of Cleveland. He was the mayor of Cleveland, and he got an idea. He had heard about a guy in New York State by the name of DeWitt Clinton, who was the governor. And how the governor built a ditch, okay, basically a ditch, a very large ditch, and a very deep ditch, but still a ditch, from Albany, New York to Buffalo. I remember when I was in grade school, got a mule, her name is Sal, 30 miles on the Erie Canal. Basically, that's what they built. That canal paid for itself within a year. And so now all of a sudden, everybody's getting canal fever, as it's called. And Alfred Kelly said, look, I heard there's been a talk about getting a canal in Ohio. In fact, there were several canals that were proposed. I'm going back and forth because this is PowerPoint. Unfortunately, I have to go back and forth. That's Alfred Kelly. I'm sorry. Oh, geez. Okay. Basically, okay. Did it again. There we go. Okay. Okay. Okay, there we go. This was his dream. His dream was getting a canal from Portsmouth on the Ohio River up to Lake Erie. That was his dream. Problem is that there was politics involved. This could not be built by 1 or 2 individuals. It had to be built by the state. And so he had to go to Columbus, and he had to start fighting for this. And it's an amazing story about if I were doing this story and I would have to go and do this, I would have quit long before Alfred Kelly had kept going. Basically, there were 3 or 4 different routes that were proposed. The major one was between Cincinnati over here, going up to Lake Erie along the western part of the state, and it's all cool because it's flat land. You dig a ditch, you keep digging, and it goes all the way to Lake Erie. This, on the other part, goes to the Continental Divide, which means it's going to go up and it's going to have to go down, which means going up the mountains requires locks, going down the mountain requires locks. Basically, as it's going to be done, 151 locks are going to be built. Canal boats go in, canal boat goes up, canal boat goes down. So what happened is that everybody is saying, we don't need this. We don't want it on this part of the state. We want it on this part of the state. And this is why it gets this strange look, by the way, is because of Ohio politics. Alfred Kelly had to basically court everybody in the state to get the canal bill signed through the legislature, to get the necessary money. So what he did was that there were a group of senators and congressmen or state representatives who said, You know, I'm in favor of a school bill, because there's going to begin in 1820, they're going to build a school bill for the first Ohio public school system, but I'm against the canal. And there were people who are in favor of the canal, they were against the school bill. So he starts playing politics. And this is where you get this weird route, because it's basically, he would go to representatives to say, yes, I want your canal. Can you make it come through my town? Please? Please let it go through my town? So instead of going straight up, it goes in this zigzag pattern. Because what happens is that these are all the various politicians in the state that needed to get the votes to go through their city. So it goes through Columbus, goes through Zanesville, and goes through Akron, and finally to Cleveland. There's still a part of that still around. It's the Ohio and Erie Canal. It's still there. It's now a national park. And it's really great to go see, because you have the towpath, which is exactly the kind of thing that they would do. You would have a canal boat. It is dug. Basically, it's 309 miles. There's 151 locks. There were 51 aqueducts that were dug in order to get stream water into the canal. It basically did all kinds of interesting things. What happened was that, as a matter of fact, it took now, because of canals, you could get across the state of Ohio in 80 hours. Okay, that was amazing. 80 hours. Okay, that was like, man, it would take days to get from Chillicothe to Cleveland by roads. Most of them dirt roads, most of them turnpikes that you would have to pay to use, because the local farmer has his street road going through his farm, and so he'd say, hey, you got to pay some money to go through my farm. So basically, this is what they began to do. Canal boats went up and they went down. There was always going to be the spin-off of what was going to happen here. To give you an idea, there's a canal boat. That's what it looked like. It cruised at a leisurely 15 miles an hour. Okay, up the canal. And people were saying that was too fast to begin with. Man was not meant to go at 15 miles an hour. Okay, what will happen to him if the speed of 15 miles an hour? Okay, they said the same thing about the first automobiles and the first trains. Trains that were going 60 miles an hour. What's that going to do to the insides of people as they're going forward at 80 miles an hour down the track? Okay. Basically, that's how they did it. They pulled it by either a mule or by horses, and the canal boats either were passenger boats or they were also mostly brought things from. They were basically, this canal is dug by hand. Okay, it's 24 feet thick. Anybody do gardening around here? I dig the holes for my wife. Okay, she just says dig a hole there, and I dig a hole there. Okay. She plants the plants. What happens here is that after about 2 feet, you get to the clay. Think about traveling down 24 feet, okay, through the clay, and it's all done by hand. There are no machines. This was done by picks and shovels and wheelbarrows, dug out every day. Most of the workers that were hired to do this were Irish immigrants that came from Ireland in the 1830s and 40s. Basically, they're going to get paid about $5 a day. They get their room and their board, plus all the whiskey they could drink, because they thought also that whiskey was going to control. Around this time of the year, the mosquitoes showed up, and you got this strange thing called ague, which was a combination of yellow fever, malaria, and whatever other disease they could put together. So they would actually give whiskey out as a curative for the ague, and they would dig it by hand. They would basically be sitting there. They dug about maybe 3 or 4 miles a month. They were set up in places along the canal. For example, there is a city known as Dublin, Ohio, which is just north of Columbus. That was the beginning. Dublin was where one of the way stations were, where the workers would stay, and they would ferry them by canal up the canal to start digging the canal. And eventually, Dublin stayed as it was and became a major city. By wheelbarrow. Digging it out, taking along planks, dumping it out by hand. Okay, I'm surprised they even got it done. Okay, it's 139 miles doing it this way. Most of the canal workers stayed in Cleveland and got jobs as stevedores or longshoremen working on the canal boats. Basically, what happens is that the canal turns Cleveland into a major city. The major problem with all of the cities along Lake Erie is that you have a whole bunch of farmers, okay? And they grow corn, they grow wheat, they grow rye. Their major source of market is not in Ohio. I mean, you can't go to one farmer buying the corn from another farmer. Their major market is in New York City. So how do you get to New York City? You could take it by road. You could take it by put it in a wheelbarrow or put it into a stagecoach. Go up the hill. Go down the hill. Go up the hill. There's that problem with the Appalachian Mountains. So there's the problem with the Appalachian Mountains. The only other way is to take it from Cleveland down to down to the Ohio River, down the Ohio River in barges to the Mississippi, down to New Orleans, put it on a ship, sail around the tip of Florida up to New York. That's the quickest way, by the way, okay, of getting there, because they haven't decided how to build tunnels through the Appalachians yet. And so what happens is that Cleveland was described by many people as a place you wouldn't want to go to anyways because there's nothing there. I mean, in 1820, for a long time, the population of Cleveland was about 12 people. Alonzo Carter with his cabin on the east bank of the Cuyahoga River and his family, that's it. And because nobody wanted to come. Where are you going to go? How are you going to get there? The problem was that there's that slight problem of the Niagara Falls. You can't take your boat over Niagara Falls to get into Lake Ontario. So the canal is going to open up Cleveland. Because of this canal, I mean, in 1834, there was 10 million pounds of goods came to Cleveland. In 1839, it went up 9 million in a matter of almost a decade. And that's all because of the canal. Wheat prices before the canal were 30 cents a bushel because you couldn't sell it to anybody. You had to give it away. Nobody wanted it. After the canal, it doubled to 60 cents a pound. Okay. In 1833 to 38, there were 2 million bushels of wheat and 500,000 pounds of flour that were shipped through Cleveland. What happened is that the industries that were spin-offs from the canal were just as important as the canal. Not only was it shipping, but also most of the time you had to create a granary in order to mill the flour. A mill was created. Several mills were created in Cleveland, which milled the grain into flour. The flour were put into barrels. The barrels have to be made. Somebody has to make the barrels. And in fact, there was going to be a young industrialist later on who was going to be buried in Lakeview Cemetery by the name of John Rockefeller. And, not well known, that guy. Basically, he started off his business making barrels. He wanted to bring an automatic barrel maker to Cleveland to build barrels to put the flour in. So he could take the barrels on the canal. And that's what he did. So Cleveland has this boom economy. Overnight, it becomes this boom town, okay, where all of a sudden the population almost triples. Most of it's going to be, in the form of immigrants who are going to come and stay. But most of the time, people are coming up the canal and staying here. Immigrants are coming from the east and coming to the Midwest and going their goods back down the canal. The problem was that the canal wasn't going to last for long, okay? Like everything else, the problem with the canal is that in the wintertime, it froze over. And it's kind of hard, to carry stuff on a frozen ditch. It's a big ditch, basically. And so what happens is that there's a new technology that takes its place. The technology is going to be iron production, by the way, to make steel. By 1830, there is going to be the development of the open hearth furnace system, which is going to take the production of steel from $100 a ton down to $5 a ton. Steel is going to be on rails. Rails are going to take locomotives. Trains go day, night, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You don't have to stop in the weather. Okay, the weather doesn't stop them. You can basically build a timetable for them, and everything is fine. Canals, you sit at the dock, and maybe the boat will show up today, maybe not. Okay. A rider will come up the towpath and say, "Guess what? Your boat's been delayed." Well, why? Well, it got into the reeds in the canal, and it's got stuck, and it's going to take a couple of days to pull them out. So what happens is that it's inefficient from that point of view, and so the railroads begin to take its place. So what happens is that the railroad takes over. What happens is that by 1856, okay, this was built in 1830, the canal was open. 20 years later, in 1856, the net income of the canal was zero. That meant they made no money because the railroads took over, okay. So what happens is that the state, which owned the canal, starts selling off parts of the canal to the railroads, who fill them in and turn. They're perfect because all you got to do is fill in the ditch, and you got a ready-made right away. So you fill in the ditch, take out the water, fill in the ditch, and then what you do is you put a railroad over it. So they start selling it off piece by piece. What had happened is that In 1872, the city of Cleveland saw that there was a need for the canal, so they bought what was going through the city of Cleveland for $125,000 from the state. They also sold the right-of-way they bought the canal from the state, and then they sold the right-of-way to a railroad who put a railroad through downtown Cleveland. Okay, and that was the way of getting their money back. Okay, in 1913 there was a flood which destroyed 3/4 of the Ohio and Erie Canal, and all the mud that was brought in through the storm basins. Nobody really wanted to fix it up. Why do we need it? We can't make any money anyway, so the canal disappears. Okay. The only reason that the canal that exists today was because American Steel and Wire needed the water to fund to keep their production and cool down their steel production. That's why the canal that's existing in the Ohio and Erie Canal that exists today is still around, because industry needed the water. And they also liked the canal. They used the canal for a while in the early 1920s back and forth to take goods and stuff up and down the canal. But beyond that, it was gone. But this is what created Cleveland. And there's not a statue to Alfred Kelly about it. Okay? He made Cleveland, basically. More than Moses Cleveland. And I don't know where the A is. It disappeared from his name. I don't know. Okay? But what happens, though, is that beginning before and after the Civil War, by 1865, there's this thing that we love to periodize things. We like to make periods out of things, even though they don't exist. I mean, you wouldn't go back to 1865 and say, "Hey guys, are you in the Second Industrial Revolution?" And you would say, "Yeah, I am." Okay. Just like I tell my students that if you went back to Florence in 1450 and went to them and say, "Hey, are you guys in the Renaissance?" I'm a Renaissance kind of guy, right? Yesterday I wasn't, but today I'm a Renaissance guy. That's not necessarily true. Same thing here, but there is this Industrial Revolution that happens. You start seeing massive production of goods and services. Okay? Industries begin to grow. It begins in the steel industry, and then it just spins off. And it's done through technology. Now, for the first time, corporations start building what is today called the factory. The best example of that still exists today is near Detroit, Michigan, called the River Rouge plant, which was created by Henry Ford. Iron ore, coal, and limestone comes in one end, and a car comes out the other end. Okay, that's what he did, and he created the River Rouge plant. Is 12 miles of production, and it's all done through technology. Without the technological innovations that I'm going to be talking about, really that much couldn't have happened in Cleveland. By 1900, it's one of the third largest industrial producers in the United States, and one of the largest producers of second largest in steel. Second largest in automobiles, third largest in garments in 1900. Okay. And what happens is that you now have, because of this, you have the creation of the modern day factory with its departments. You have what would be called mass production, a creation of technology. You have workers now no longer, it used to take the process of, say, for example, of doing iron. There used to be an ironmonger. I love that name, ironmonger. Okay. An iron molder who used to make a mold, and used to make the mold, and the ironmonger would put the melted iron into the mold. The mold would be taken out, and that's how you would produce your iron. All those steps were taken away with technology. Okay, with what you end up having, that. Okay, that's Cleveland, by the way, 1940s. That's the Republic Steel plant. Okay, love the smoke, don't you? Just the smoke, yes. This is a fraction of what you would see in Pittsburgh, for example. I went and got my master's degree from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, and I went there in the late 70s, and I was on the dorm. I lived in the dorm in Duquesne. I would come out in the morning, and the native Pittsburghers would say, "It's a good day." Why is it a good day? I see the first 6 flights of the U.S. Steel building. There's no smog. Okay, you can see the first 6. Can never see the top. I never ever saw the top from the smog coming from the steel mills. When Andrew Carnegie was asked by a reporter, you're polluting the land, all that smoke is bad for people, he says, that smoke is profit. Okay, it's money to me. And that's what happens. You have the modern day factory production. Workers become unskilled workers, producing on an assembly line, producing materials, producing thousands and thousands of pieces of whatever they're making, whether it be steel or cars or light bulbs, whatever it is. And because of it, you now have massive production, which means you have to have massive consumption, which means people got to start buying this stuff. Okay? What good is having 30,000 light bulbs if there's not 30,000 people buying them? Okay? So that's where you end up with having advertising is created in the late 19th century to get people to buy things that they really don't need, but they don't want to buy things. And so what happens is that all of this has created this huge industrial production, which created the United States as the second largest industrial production in the world. Okay. Because of this industrial production and the creation of industries, the population triples. It goes from 160,000 to over 300,000. In a matter of 30 years, okay? Just a matter of 40 years. The reason for this population boom, one of the reasons is an immigration to the city of Cleveland. And it's not just to Cleveland, but it's all over the United States. But to Cleveland, there's a push and there's a pull. I like the push and the pull. When I teach immigration history, I talk about pushing and pulling. The pushing is where you have immigrants who lived primarily in Eastern and Central Europe at this time, who basically are leaving for either mostly economic reasons. Some are leaving for religious reasons because they're being persecuted. Some for political reasons. I started a revolution and the Tsar didn't like me. So I had to leave, okay, real quick, okay. So there's that also, but it's this push out of Europe, the old country, as my grandmother used to call it, the old country, to America. That's the push, but there's a pull here. I mean, there are just, for example, there are just as many Poles living in the United States as there are in Brazil. Okay, one of the reasons for the pull here is those industries. We need those workers that are willing to work doing this 8 hours a day, which is what I used to do in college. In those days, when I was in college, my father said, you got to go to work. Okay, so in the summer times, I worked for one summer in the steel mills. Okay. And all I did was take sand from over here and put it over there. And I always wondered, why am I taking sand and putting it over here and putting it over there? Why am I doing this? And the guy, I kept asking the guy, the foreman, he goes like, none of your business, just keep doing it. And so he finally told me, this is why. He took me into the blast furnace to show me where all that sand was going. So what happens is that by 1890, there's 2,900 factories in Cleveland. Now, what drives historians crazy sometimes are statistics, okay? Statistical studies were done, but the problem is that they wouldn't ask the questions that I would ask if I were sitting behind them. They said 2,900 factories. Well, what do you call a factory? They called a factory, a machine shop was a factory to the person that was doing this, okay? And a machine shop that could be big as a garage, that's it, okay? That's a factory, okay? And so there were 2,900 factories in Cleveland. Employed 12% of the population of Cleveland in these factories. That's a small number, but it's going to get bigger and bigger. What you end up having is my favorite. You end up having a city of Cleveland, which is not a city but a city of neighborhoods. You end up having neighborhoods. You end up having places like Bird's Nest. I mean, some of these are still around. The Bird's Nest is still around in Tremont or in Lakewood. The Angle, nope. Dutch Hill isn't around anymore. Big Italy, which is still around. Little Italy isn't around. There's a large German community where my office is today. Okay, unfortunately. That's no longer there. There was the Cedar Central, Buckeye Road, Big Italy, Little Italy. There's going to be Whiskey Island, Ohio City, Tremont, which is around. Some of them are still around, most of them aren't. These are ethnic neighborhoods where the immigrants came and they lived. Built a church, built a school. And there's all these Eastern European churches all over Cleveland, okay? Each one is developed by, I came from a certain part of Croatia, okay? And that's where I came from, and I'm building a church like we did in that part of Croatia, okay? And this was basically for the workers a way of being a way of a buffer against the larger society they're living in. Think about it, if you come to a country, you don't speak the language. All of a sudden, you're in a plant, and you get a job, and you're told by the boss, these are the rules. And they take you into a room, and this is not in Cleveland, but the International Harvester plant in Gary, Indiana, which had on the walls in framed posters in 38 different languages the rules for the plant. And they would say, well, what language do you speak? Well, there it is. Okay, and that's how they would do it. Basically, the first major industry in Cleveland is going to be the iron and steel industry. In 1860, according to the census, and again, censuses drive me crazy too, because census's only purpose is to count people, okay? And every 10 years, Congress determines what they want to count. I mean, beyond the general count of the people, how many people are living in Cleveland. They also ask other questions. In 1840, for example, they asked how many domestic servants work in how many people have domestic servants. In 1850, they didn't ask that question, so you don't know whether it changed or whether it went up or down or whatever. But in 1860, there were 374 employees and 3 iron foundries. By 1890, it's going to be 3,000. 700 of those are children. The children were needed in the plant. The law stipulated you could go to 6th grade, and that's it. Okay, sometimes I give my students the 6th grade test that they give in 6th grade, or the high school, or the 8th grade test that they give in Iowa back in the 1890s, and they go like, what? Name all the continents and every river in Latin America? Kind of thing. In 1900, there are 6,000 employees and 20 factories, and by 1900, it's the 5th largest in the United States. Okay, which isn't bad compared to Pittsburgh, Gary, Chicago, and a few other places. Okay, where steel is dominant. Okay. And it's all because of geography and some people. Why Cleveland? It's because, first of all, you have to, in order to make steel, you need iron ore. And iron ore just happens to be in one place. There's a huge amount of it on the Mesabi Range in Wisconsin, in Minnesota. Okay, give you an idea, that's where it is. Okay, this is why you have Dutch Harbor and Silver Bay and so forth. Okay, and this is the other reason for Cleveland, is the transportation. As you can see, they got to get they call it Taconite Harbor even to this day. You got to get the iron ore from Lake Superior down to where it's supposed to go. And it just so happens, Lake Erie happens to be one of those lakes. Andrew Carnegie, in order to cut his costs for his steel mills in Pittsburgh, since they don't have iron ore near Pittsburgh, had to get it. He would, for example, create what he called Carnegie Shipping Company, which he had his Carnegie mines in Wisconsin, which then put it onto Carnegie ships, which were shipped to the Carnegie docks, which were at Conneaut, Ohio, taken from the Carnegie ships onto the Carnegie Railroad, which was then taken down to Pittsburgh. All of it was owned by Andrew Carnegie. And so that's why Cleveland became what it was, because of shipping. Because of that. Okay. Also, that's a boat they invented that is only on the Great Lakes. That's a shipping boat. That's the Cleveland Cliffs Corporation, the William G. Mather, the Mather family of Cleveland, and that's another reason for steel growing in Cleveland, because there's a guy by the name of William Mather and another guy by the name of Marcus Hanna, and they decided to do something. They decided to get together and they decide, this is really cool. We could control all the shipping on the Great Lakes, okay? And they did for a while, and they formed a company called Cleveland Cliffs. And they controlled, and eventually they're going to control about 85 to 90% of all the iron ore, all the shipping on the Great Lakes through Cleveland Cliffs. I can get that right. Let me go back here. Okay, the Cleveland Cliffs. They controlled 80% of the traffic. There is, one of the houses for the Mathers is one of the part of the family is the Gwynns. And there's in Bratnell, the Gwynn Estates. And Mr. Gwynn built that house on the lake for a reason. Not because he just liked the lake, it's for a reason. So he could go out every day, and he would get the notification from his office in downtown when his ships were coming into port. And he would go with his telescope and look to see if the ship is there. And if the ship isn't coming into Cleveland, he then sends a telegraph to the captain, where are you? Why are you delayed? Okay, where's my ship? Okay, and that's what they did. He and Marcus Hanna and Samuel Mather made a ton of money running shipping to this day. Today it's called it's called Parker Hannifin. Cleveland Cliffs became part of Parker, Columbia became part of Parker Hannifin. And it's still around to this day, producing ships, you see them on the Cuyahoga River, 1,000-footers. My father, there's a family history. My father worked for a long time being an engineer on these ships. He worked for a different company. And for a while there, again, in order to pay for my college, he says, why don't you go on the boats? I know a captain, go on the boats for a summer. My first and last, only summer on the boats, okay. It was the greatest experience sitting in the middle of Lake Superior at 3 o'clock in the morning, going out of your bunk because there's a storm coming, okay, and you're going like this in the boat. But it was an interesting life. What happens though is that because of the iron ore being here, you now have some entrepreneurs that come along and build things. You have Mr. Chisholm. One of the things I take my students to sometimes is when I get a chance, I take my class to Lakeview Cemetery. And my students say, why are you taking me to a cemetery? I said, because the cemetery is the history of Cleveland, okay? The movers and shakers of Cleveland are all under. The entire middle class of Cleveland is buried there, okay? And the first thing I ask my students to look at are these tombstones. And he said, why do you want to look at the tombstones? They're cute. What about them? Even in death, the middle class in Cleveland was fighting each other as to who's got the better tombstones, okay? Rockefeller said, I'm going to be better than all of them. I'm putting mine on top of a hill so I can overlook all of them, okay? And he did. The Rockefellers have a huge pylon at Lakeview overlooking everybody, except the president. They had to build that crazy thing next to him. And they almost tried to get rid of it until they decided he was assassinated. Remember, you can't do this. This is for the kids of Cleveland. And so that's why the monument of McKinley is over there, and he's over there across the street, okay? Basically, William started, if you walk into Lakeview Cemetery and you walk in the front, there's this huge statue of William Chisholm. That's not where he's buried. There's just a statue of him in the front entrance. He's buried somewhere else in the cemetery, but there's this huge chapter of William Chisholm saying, I'm the guy that gave most of the money for this. Hi, okay? And he started the Cleveland Rolling Mill, which if you go today up Broadway Avenue into Slavic Village and into Garfield, as you're going to Garfield Heights, and look on Jones Street and look over, the remnants of the plant are still there. They produced a rolling mill produces steel in a unique way. That is the rolling mill, what it looked like at its heyday in 1890. As you can see, again, the trains are bringing the coal in from southern Ohio and limestone from southern Ohio to the plant. That's why it's built right near, because it's right next to a railroad line. Basically, this is what they did. They took hot steel and basically rolled it in a machine, rolled it back and forth, pulling it. That's why they're calling it rolling it. Basically the same way you make pasta. It's like a huge pasta maker. Except this thing happens to be 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? It's kind of hot, okay? And think about doing this in the winter, it's not that bad. Think about doing it when it's 90 degrees with 180% humidity outside, okay? And that's what they would do. They would roll the steel back and forth to make plates, or to make ingots, or to make rails, or wire, steel wire. But that's what the rolling mill did. That's what their job was. I once showed this at another one I was on. There was an engineer there. He wanted to know what this guy was for. I have no idea what that guy's doing. I have no idea. Basically, that's how it's done today. Okay, it's done by a machine. It comes through the machine. I was fortunate enough to be able to take a tour of the Old Republic, which is the Excelsior Metal tour, several years ago. And as I was walking, getting the tour, I was like, where are all the people? I mean, you got all these machines that are working. And the guy said, look up. And up in an air-conditioned booth are all the guys with their computers, and they're rolling out steel and cutting it by the computer. Okay, it comes through the roller, and comes in ingots, and then you fashion it the way you want to do it. The other industry that's going to become big is petroleum. Petroleum existed for a long time. Everybody knew about petroleum, they just didn't know what to do with it. In fact, for a while there, petroleum was used as the basis of a patent medicine in the 1850s. People would drink oil as a medicine. Yes. Rub it in on their joints. Got arthritis, makes it feel better. Rub some 10W20. Because nobody really knew what it was for. This stuff was bubbling out of the water, out of the ground in Pennsylvania, near Titusville, and nobody knew what to do with it. Okay, until again, it's these stories. Part of the stories of this particular period in American history are the stories of individual people tinkering in their basement. Charles Goodyear tinkered in his basement to create a way of making rubber so it doesn't melt, called vulcanization. And he used things like arsenic in his basement. Okay, had all these chemicals. For a while, his wife had to leave because of the fact that the stench that was coming from the basement was so bad. Same thing here. There was a chemist, or what would be an apothecary, a pharmacist in Pittsburgh, that started playing with oil. I don't know why. He started filtering around with it, boiling it, throwing stuff together, and he discovered the way of refining it into kerosene. And in the industrial history of the United States and the world, one of the major issues of industrial history is serendipity, okay? Which means it just happened to be at the right time at the right place. At the right time, at the right place, at the same time, America was going through a problem. Most of our illumination for homes was done by whale oil, okay? And what had happened is that whale oil, we had basically killed most of the whales, most of the sperm whales, and there weren't that many left. And they're becoming less and less, and the whale oil production is going down. So what are you going to heat your house with? What are you going to illuminate your house with? That's where kerosene then comes in. Okay, and what happens is that the refining industry takes over. Okay, it begins in Titusville, and because of the railroad again, you're trying to ship it. Cleveland becomes a center of refining first, and you have Mr. Canfield, who was the first man to do something. Canfield is the first man to refine things, to start refining in Cleveland. Okay, basically he is going to refine oil, take petroleum and turn it into kerosene. Later on, because of Henry Ford, he's going to take it and refine it into gasoline, but originally it's kerosene. And what happens is that he makes a mint. He builds the first service station in Cleveland, which is no longer around. It's a parking lot. Don't get me started on that. And historical monuments in this town. Okay, there are parking lots of condominiums. Okay, or something else. What happened though is that there was going to be a young guy again who made his living making barrels, playing the stock market. John Davidson Rockefeller. Okay, Rockefeller is a unique guy. Okay, I mean he's either hated or loved, depending on which. I mean, he's one of those few people. There's never anything in between. It's either you love the guy or you hate the guy. Okay. One of the things he used to do is that he used to hand out dimes to children. He'd say, "Here's a dime. Start your future. Put it in the bank. You get 2% interest, and blah blah blah. You'll get, by the time you're 30, you'll make millions of dollars like me." Okay. And that is why, if you go to his grave at Lakeview, people put dimes on his grave. That's where it comes from. They're putting it on his grave. They put coins on his grave for that reason. He gets it in his head, the money is not pumping the oil out of the ground. It's not there. It's not pumping it out of the ground. It's refining it into kerosene. And so he starts a company called Standard Oil. And basically what he begins to do is he begins to refine oil into kerosene. But the problem is that everybody's refining oil into kerosene. And not all the oil is in the United States. It kind of drove Rockefeller crazy that there was a huge amount of oil in Indonesia and in Russia. And for a while there, he wanted to control all the oil in the world. He wanted to do that. And there was a war that was started between him and the head of Royal Dutch Shell over that, okay, to control all the oil in the world, okay? And in fact, he had industrial spies all over the world. Everywhere there was a hint of an oil well being dug, he went to find out what's going on. Eventually, he's going to leave Cleveland and move to New York, 26 Broadway, which was going to be the headquarters for Standard Oil. He's going to have, it's an unusual relationship he has with his employees. He never celebrated Christmas or Easter or whatever. He always, every year, nor his birthday, he never celebrated his birthday, he celebrated his job day. The day he got his first job. All the vice presidents show up at 26 Broadway and they all have a party, have a cake and everything, and give presents because of his job day. Okay, that's when I got my first job. What he began to do is in Cleveland is refining the oil into kerosene and then later into gasoline. By hook or by crook, some would say more by crook than anything else, he began to control the production, the refinery production in the United States. What he would do is that he would go and he did what is called in the world of economics, what's called horizontal integration, which is basically illegal to do. He would go to his competitors and say, "Hi, I'm John D. Rockefeller. Yeah, so what? I'd like to buy your company for X amount of money. Will you sell it to me?" Most of the time, the other guy would say, "Get out of the office, you young punk," and throw him out of the office. Okay, fine. One of his methods was to lower his kerosene, the price so low that the other guy goes out of business and he buys him at auction. But he discovered he was losing money doing that, and the production of kerosene was going up and down. It was impossible to do that. Instead, he found a different way. He would go to that next producer and he would say, "Guess what? How would you like to be a vice president for Standard Oil? Okay, you're still running your company. I'm going to hold your company. That's why it's called a trust. I'm buying 51% of your stock and holding it in trust. And you're going to be a vice president for Standard Oil." "Sure, what am I going to do?" "Nothing. You just come to your office and sit there." 38 vice presidents just came to their office and sat there. Okay, and were paid large amounts of money to go to their office and sit there so he could control it. Eventually, what was going to happen was that the United States Navy was going to go from a coal-fired production to diesel production for their ships, diesel is a byproduct of oil, and John Rockefeller controls the oil in the United States. He just controls the refining. Could he tell us how much he's going to sell our diesel for to the Navy? So that starts a rumor mill. There is also the fact that Rockefeller is not well liked by a lot of people. Sometimes he had a tendency to make people very angry at them. Sometimes he would just want to kill you, okay, for what you said. And so what happens is that there was a statute that was created called the Sherman Antitrust Act, which made all trusts in the United States or combination organizations or combination of organizations whose purposes to restrain trade is illegal in the United States. If he was the first man that went after. When they broke up the Standard Oil Trust, every domestic oil company that exists today was once owned by Rockefeller. That's how powerful he was. Okay, we're talking about Exxon, Texaco, all of them that are domestic ones were owned by Rockefeller, which means he was a very wealthy and powerful man. So much so that eventually he started the Rockefeller Foundation because he needed his reputation to be cleaned up a little bit. So he started giving out money, and because he was actually also following around the fact that the other great industrialists at the time were doing the same thing. People like Carnegie were starting his foundation. Well, I could do better than Carnegie. Okay, that Pittsburgh guy. I could do better. And so he started the Rockefeller Foundation. To this day, the Rockefeller Foundation gives out millions of dollars of grants every year. It has not yet touched the principal, just the interest on the money. Probably the estimate is going to go on for another millennium, right? Whatever. Basically, that's what it looks like. It's on Broadway Avenue. It was on Broadway. If you get off on Broadway and 490, where 490 is, to get off at the Broadway exit and come down Broadway, that's where it was. Down. It's still there today on a smaller one, but that's where it is today. There was an immigrant by the name of Mr. Vicek who came to Cleveland as a Slovenian, and he decided to write his life story in a diary. And when he came to Cleveland, one of the things he did was that he moved to Broadway because his sister was there. And so he moved to Broadway. Next day he said, you got to go get a job. So his brother-in-law says, let's go and get a job at the refinery because that's where I'm working. I'm going to take you to the refinery. So they go down to this refinery to get a job, and he writes in his diary, when he was coming back and it was late at night, he noticed that the river, which is a branch of the Cuyahoga River, the creek that flows into the Cuyahoga River, which goes to the property, was an interesting color. It was all different rainbow colors, okay? Because of the fact that Standard Oil took all of the byproduct that they didn't need, which was mostly sulfuric acid and a few other things, and threw it in the river. And it flowed into the Cuyahoga, which caused it to go, which is one of the reasons it would catch on fire every so often. The one in 1967 was just the one that made the national papers. It had gone on fire several times before that, okay, from all the stuff. Basically what happened is that he noticed how the river was a cute little rainbow color, and his brother says, don't go near it, don't touch it, don't drink it. Okay. He says, it was nothing like the rivers back in the old country where they had babbling brooks and everything. And he was wondering about the smoke, the smog, the sounds, that kind of thing. To the point where, it seemed that all of Cleveland was becoming one huge production ground. As a byproduct of the petroleum industry, you have the chemical industry comes about. It becomes a byproduct. Mr. Griselli, who immigrated from Italy to come to Cleveland, was using the byproducts of the stuff that Rockefeller was using in Standard Oil to produce linseed oil. He created linseed oil, he created sulfuric acids, he created battery acids. Griselli Chemical became well known for making acids, which you need for batteries and so forth. Sulfuric acid, mostly battery acid. What happened was that Griselli basically was bought out by another guy by the name of DuPont. It became part of the DuPont empire in the 1920s. But the other person, which is a famous Cleveland name, if you go to the Midland Tower building, which is downtown, which is where Sherwin-Williams headquarters are, they have a neat history of the company in the lobby, all pictures, which they only have because it's in their archives and you can't get into it. Basically, Mr. Williams decided to start making linseed oil, which was a chemical product, to produce paint. They eventually ended up making what is the famous Sherwin-Williams White. I guess native Clevelanders know Sherwin-Williams White, which basically has lead in it. It's lead paint. They also came up with the idea of selling directly to the consumer, so they would sell their paint directly to the consumer by having, even today, their shops where they would sell paint. Another industry which they named a high school of, I have several students in my classroom from Brush High School. I ask them, how did Brush get its name? They go like, I don't know. Okay. Basically, you have Mr. Charles Brush. Mr. Brush got into the electrical industry by producing carbon-based products. Okay. Again, another byproduct of a lot of the stuff. He is known for creating these arc carbons. Again, these are still used today in searchlights. If you look at a searchlight when it's off, don't look at it when it's on, but when it's off, there's these huge rods in there. Those are the arc carbons. They're 99.9% pure carbon. You hook an electrode to it, you light it up, and it creates this huge, bright white searchlight. One day, the problem in Cleveland was the fact that the city streets were not well lit. And there was a lot of crime in the city. A lot of people were complaining that Cleveland was too dark. So Brush got an idea. He went to the city and said, I'm going to light up the downtown by using arc carbons. And they said, all right, we use gas now, which meant they had a guy that went every day, went down. He opened up the thing, lit the gas, closed it, went to the next one, opened it up, lit the gas, and closed it. Every morning, went back, kind of thing. So he creates the arc carbon, which he creates these for public square. He lit a public square with arc carbons. And it was great. Nobody bought anything. Okay. The problem was that his competitor was Germany. They had created arc carbons much better, and they held the patent to the arc carbons. But it didn't stop him. He used his technology to create National Carbon Company, which, if you live in certain parts of Lakewood, that's synonymous with home to a lot of people. I know I live in Birdtown. The National Carbon Company was going to create carbon-based products. They created arc carbons, but they also created magnetos for telephones, the carbon filters for the first gas masks that Garrett Morgan invented that were used. They made a huge amount of money during World War I and World War II with carbon-based products. Originally, their plant was on East 55th Street, somewhere on East 55th. Mysteriously, according to the official corporate records, a worker, a night watchman, was holding a kerosene lamp, and he forgot about it, and it fell over and burned down the building. And it just so happened the major shareholder of the company, Mr. Patterson at the time, had this land sitting in Lakewood that was just vacant. And he said, hey guys, I got this new plant. Let's build this building. Let's build our new plant in Lakewood, which they did on 117th. But the problem is that most of the workers lived in Cleveland, and they took the rapid or the streetcar to get to work. The streetcar ended at West 98th Street. So for most of the time, they would have to get out at West 98th Street, trudge through the snow, the rain, the mud, to get to work, and they're always late. So he got an idea. He said, I'm going to do what I've heard from other corporations are doing in America and create myself a corporate town. Okay? He took part of what was left over of the buildings of his property on the east side of the property and started building buildings, building houses, and selling them to the workers. His wife was a amateur bird watcher, so she demanded, I guess, that all the streets be named after birds. So that's why it's plover, robin, quail. It's called today Birdtown for that reason, because all the streets are named after birds. Because his wife insisted that they be named after birds, and he did what his wife wanted him to do. In Cleveland, it's one of the few examples still left of what are called a Cleveland double, which is a unique kind of house in Cleveland, which is like two apartments on top of another. But the entrance is usually, and normally the entrance to the upstairs is in the back. On the Cleveland double, the entrances are on the front, for both the front and the upstairs and the downstairs are on the front. That's a uniquely Cleveland thing. It's not seen anywhere else. And when I started asking questions about why do they have this, the most interesting answer I got was the fact it was easier for the police to conduct a raid on the house, okay, if the entrances were in the front instead of in the back, because they would have to cover the back, so the people would cut out the back, so they would have them in the front. But that's what happened. It became Birdtown, which is still around to this day. Mr. Westinghouse comes along with General Electric. Westinghouse shows up in Cleveland very late. They're going to have their plant's going to be on the Route 2 curve when you go around the edge of Route 2 as you're coming out of Cleveland. And so what happens is that basically they're going to create Westinghouse products, the same thing that GE created, which is basically everything made out of electricity Westinghouse makes. Okay, and GE would say everything that can produces electricity, GE makes, only better than Westinghouse. Okay, Mr. Westinghouse and Mr. GE always had an argument because Westinghouse was from Pittsburgh, and my hometown is Erie, Pennsylvania. If you ever drive by there, a lot of people drive through there on I-90. They never stop, but they drive through there. Half of my family worked for GE in Lawrence Park. That's when they made locomotives, and everybody at GE were saying Westinghouse is nothing. We make things better at GE. And so what happens is that they're going to create, GE is going to come into Cleveland, and one of the things they're going to make in Cleveland is light bulbs. And they created NELA Park, which is the National Electric Lamp Association. NELA Park is a research lab. It's in East Cleveland. Let me see if I have a picture of it. Oh, that's the National Carbon Plant. That's NELA Park. It's a research lab where they work with lighting. Need your building done? They'll come in and design your lighting for you. Okay. GE is going to make light bulbs in Cleveland and some electrical motors, but most of Cleveland is a light bulb industry, and not much more for Cleveland. Okay. The biggest partner is going to be Westinghouse and a few others, and National Carbon. Oh, by the way, National Carbon also had as a byproduct a company called Eveready Battery Company. And Eveready batteries were made at Battery Park, which was on Detroit Avenue and West 50-something in Detroit. Today it's called Battery Park. The place closed down several years ago, so they built, again, they knocked down the buildings, the factory, and they built apartments, and they kept the power. It was such a cute little building. So they kept the power station and turned it into a restaurant on Battery Park, okay? And they made batteries there. The other industry in Cleveland, and these are not necessarily, I'm just going through them, not chronologically, just by subject, is the garment industry. Cleveland was the second largest industry in the United States, and it became really big because of ready-made clothing. In the old days, if you wanted a suit made, you would have to go to a tailor, and the tailor would measure you and make the whole suit, okay? Around the turn of the century, an idea came about called ready-made clothing, okay, or what today's called off the rack. Okay, you go and what you do is you get sized up and there's your shirt, you buy it. Okay, and it's made in pieces. Okay, it's called piece rate. And what happens is that the sleeves are made, the shirt waist, and the collars were made 3 different ways. Okay, and then attached in the factory together. Okay, and so the ready-made clothing industry made Cleveland. Okay, it's mostly in the east side of town. It was primarily within the German Jewish population, which was around East 30th, right where my office is. There is a plaque I found at Progressive Field, in fact, which has on it the first Jewish synagogue sat here. I was wondering, it's interesting that they made a plaque. And that was going to be the center of the garment industry. Most of the time, these are family companies, okay, which are going to be, the factory is a house. On the lower part of the house is the workers, and the guy who owns it lives upstairs. This is way before they had workplace safety rules. And so what would happen is that you would have banks of girls and women, mostly girls and women, working in a room on a sewing machine, 12 hours a day. Working, doing pieces, putting things together, stitching shirts or sleeves to shirts, collars to shirts, whatever it's taking. You have some of the famous ones, for example, Kaufman and Kalk, which became Joseph and Feiss. The one that was going to last the longest in Cleveland, which was Joseph and Feiss. Eventually, it's going to become so big in the ready-made clothing industry that they are going to be able to build their own factory, which is going to be on the west side near, right off of I-90 near, now it's apartments again. Of course, I don't know if they're building them or not. There was talk they were going to take the old Joseph and Feiss building and make it into apartments. I don't know, last time I saw it's still abandoned, so I don't know whether that's going to go. But the Joseph and Feiss Corporation was there. They produced clothing. Okay. Eventually, it's going to become known as Hugo Boss. And today, there's the last one living in the last group in Cleveland still around, Hugo Boss, and they're just living on the edge. Okay, every so often I hear from people saying it's going to close, it's going to close soon. Yes, ma'am.
Was there slavery tailor or something?
Yeah.
All the band uniforms.
Yes, it was also.
What happened to them?
All gone. All of the clothing industry in Cleveland's gone. What happened is that it it was attacked by, it was taken over by competition from two places. One is New York City, which became the center of the garment industry. And then in the 1960s and 70s, there is going to be, the corporations are going to outplace by going down to Guatemala and out of the country because of the labor, cheap labor, and producing it outside the United States. And that's what's going to happen. It's going to kill the garment industry in the United States. Yeah. Yes.
Because can the government in the last 7 years stepping in to stop the trend? Or just
Nope.
let it go?
Nope. They just let it go. It's business. It's capitalism. That's what they would argue. And there have been attempts by people to try to stop it. It's never been really stopped that much. The reason for the trend going back is that there has been a trend coming back. One of the reasons being is that there have been laws put in the 1980s. There was the Made in USA Act, which said if 80% of your garment, to have a Made in USA label, has to be 80% has to be made in the United States. So that started bringing back garment industry. But the fact of the matter is the demand isn't just there anymore for clothing. The clothing industry kind of just fell apart. H. Black and Company was another one. The warehouse district was the warehouse district's first creation was as a garment industry. They started in downtown and moved down into the flats, into what is called today the warehouse district, which is all where trendy bars, and of course not bars like I think of them. Cleveland Worsted Mills, which is one of the largest. That's the Worsted Mills Company. It's not there anymore. Okay, the building's still there, but the company is. It's on the east side. It's a warehouse. It's all warehousing. But basically, that used to be the Worsted Mills. I mean, woolen clothing. Yeah. At its heyday, it was producing. At its heyday, it had over 20,000 employees. Okay, producing woolen clothes, woolen socks, wool sweaters, whatever it is. Okay. The buildings are still there. This is, when I was a kid, every Easter, you had to get a suit, okay? Except when I came here, I had to go to Robert Hall because there is no Richmond Brothers in Erie. Here it was Richmond Brothers, okay? This is the original Richmond Brothers on Ontario and Prospect Avenue. This is the showroom. You walked in and that's where you got your, you got fitted as to what you wanted. You chose your suit and it was all done here. At the top were the cutters. The cutters took huge amounts of cotton cloth and put them on a table, put a mold on it, a pattern on it, and then used a bandsaw. It looks like a huge bandsaw to produce the shirt waists. And they were taken all the way down, step by step by step by step. Each floor had a different production process, to the point where at the end the shirt came down at the bottom. Okay, that's where it was originally, on Prospect in Ontario, Richmond Brothers. A lot of people remember Richmond Brothers because they had a great advertising campaign for that reason. Again, they're going to be the ones that are going to last out the longest, along with Joseph and Feiss. Oh boy, here we go. Okay, okay. Let me see. Okay, the stockyards. It's on the west side of Cleveland. It's not there anymore, but the stink, I understand, used to sift all the way into Tremont, okay, because of it. That's where all the farmers brought all of their goods. So the farmers brought all their goods, all their animals for they're not only going to be killed there and done, they're going to be put on ships. But it's still a neighborhood of Cleveland called the Cleveland Stockyards. You can find it. That's only as a name only. Okay. The other one is going to be the automobile industry. Cleveland is going to be number 2. And for a while it was number 1 in the United States. Only be taken over by that city that's over there called Detroit. And that's because of Mr. Ford and Mr. Chrysler and Mr. Olds. It's interesting. R.E. Olds was born and raised and created his Oldsmobile company in Geneva, Ohio. That's where he's from. I mean, that's the only thing Geneva's known for. They have a big sign. R.E. Olds was born here. But yet he was sold out to GM in Michigan, okay? You have all these companies that were created in Cleveland, small companies. You have Winton was the first one. Mr. Winton was originally a carriage maker. And what he would do is that he would take a carriage, which is what was usually done in the old days. A carriage. Okay. Thank you. A carriage maker took a carriage and put a gasoline-powered engine on it. Okay. It had bicycle tires. Okay. Okay. It had no shock absorbers. Okay. It had no lights. It had no turn signals. It had no horn. Okay. And this comes in a day and age when most of the automobile industry is in its infancy, where there are states that had laws that said, for example, one state had a law that said, if an automobile is going down the road, there must be preceded by a person 50 feet in front of them with a red flag announcing an automobile is approaching, so it doesn't backfire and scare the horses. So it didn't, that didn't work too well. This is handmade. It's a carriage with an automobile engine put on it. Because of an invention in Germany by Daimler and by Mr. Benz, primarily Mr. Benz, to create the single double-stroke engine, internal combustion engine, it worked. What originally really first started was the steam engine, the steam car. It was driven by a steam engine. That, in fact, there was a first race in France in 1905 between Daimler and a Frenchman who built a steam-driven car. The steam car won over the gasoline-powered engine. Okay, and the reason being is that it only needed so much water and so much time to fill. And so what happens is that there were steam-driven cars, there were electric-driven cars, there were internal combustion cars. Winton didn't know what to do. These are made for the rich and famous in Cleveland, because a car like this costs like the entire year's salary of a steel worker, okay, because it was done by hand. That's the plant. Each chassis was hand done by a group of workers. Okay, now Winton had a problem. Nobody was buying his cars. Okay, because nobody had a use for them. And what are you going to do with them? I mean, they're great recreational vehicles. You can drive, but there's no roads. The roads are bad. There's no highways. What do you do with these suckers? I mean, and what am I going to do with this? So he decided to do an advertising ploy. What he did was that he went to his friend Jephthah Wade. Mr. Wade made his money by starting a company called Western Union. Okay, and in fact, he's the one that set up Wade Chapel in Lakeview Cemetery. That's it. He got the chapel. He got all of that is Tiffany glass that was brought by Canal to Cleveland. So what happened was that Wade said, okay, it's a cool idea. He put one of these cars together, put a car together, and he's going to say, I'm going to drive from Cleveland to New York. And he did. And along the way, he would tap in every night to the telegraph, and what he would do is that he would send the plain dealer to Wade, and Wade would give to the plain dealer a weekly thing of what he did today. And it was published on the front pages of the plain dealer. Everybody ate up the plain dealer. Listen, today I wandered into a cow. The cow chased us for 5 miles because it didn't know who we were, okay? We were going a speedy 5 miles an hour, okay? And basically that was what was going to happen. The problem with Winton is the fact that he's not going to go into competition. The competition is going to be in Detroit when you have, at the turn of the century, you have Ford who decides to put an engine, a gasoline-powered engine, onto a car and create the Model T. Okay, and he came up with that, and because of that, Ford became #1 in the country. And cars here kind of disappeared, or they were still made, but they were made for the exclusive people. Okay, another company that was going to come about was because of this. Everybody in Cleveland has a Singer sewing machine, I swear, okay? Everybody knows a Singer sewing machine because a White sewing machine, forgive me, a White sewing machine, because Mr. White started a sewing machine company. Mr. White came up with an idea. Actually, it wasn't his idea, it was his son's. His sons came to him one day and said, Dad, we don't want to be in the sewing machine business. We think it's boring. Dad's going like, wait a minute. This company's going to be yours someday and you don't want to do this? What do you want to do? We want to build cars. That's cool. That's hip. That's, turn of the century kind of stuff. We want to do that. So Daddy says there's 2 things I could do. I could say, no, you're going to go work in the factory and that's just cause problems. Or I'll give you the money, get it out of your system and come back. They'll come back to me and make sewing machines. So they went out and gave him the money and they made a car. It was a steam-driven car. The problem with the steam-driven cars was the fact they were notorious for the fact of exploding because the boiler was right underneath the driver's seat. And if you just didn't put the right amount mixture of heat and water and watch the temperature and make sure everything was going fine, it had a tendency to explode, okay? And so they built this car, and nobody wanted to buy it, and the company folded. So they come back to Dad. Dad goes, okay, yeah, fine. You're finally gonna come back and make sewing machines. And they said, can we have some more money? And they said, what do you want? He said, well, you know, Dad, in the United States, there's only 2 companies that do this. One is called Mack, the other one's called Peterbilt. They make trucks. There's only 2 companies in the United States that make trucks. We got a pretty good chance of getting into that area. All we need again is money. This time, Dad demanded a piece of the company, which he did. He got a piece of the company. They formed what was called White Motor Company, and they made trucks. And it exploded. The company exploded on St. Clair Avenue was their factory. It's no longer there again. It used to be 35th and St. Clair. It's gone. I saw it going through. I used to take my students on tours sometimes, and of Cleveland. It's kind of, over the years, I've seen it going from a building to a pile of bricks to a vacant lot, okay, over the period of 5 years, and that's what happened to it. They built trucks. White had their famous White Tower, which is still there. They couldn't take that down. The neighborhood loved the white thing. They also kept the corporate headquarters because it was all mahogany inside. So you think of all the mahogany buildings you could create, all the apartments you could make. And on top of that, it's iconic. You can't take down an iconic symbol like White Motor. And they made trucks. They made trucks, they made buses, they made Jeeps, they made ambulances for the government. For World War I and World War II, they made money hand over fist. In 1980, they were sold to a company called Saab. Saab made the promise that they would keep the plant open, okay? And they did. They didn't say for how long, okay? And they did keep it open. They kept it open for a couple of years, found out that they could not compete because the technology that was used in the plant was so old that in order to upgrade the technology, in order to compete with, happened to be their own company of Saab, okay, in building their trucks, that they decided to close it down. It was easier to close it down. They did. They closed it down. And the company disappeared. But for a long time, trucks were synonymous with White Motor, okay? Buses, planes, trains, you know, people remembers White Motor Company. It's one of those iconic Cleveland businesses. With that, my tour of Cleveland is basically over. Do you have any questions? I know, it's a very quick tour. I know, isn't it? Yeah, okay. It's a very quick tour, I know. Thank you.